This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jarvis McInnis, who teaches in the Department of English at Duke University. Along with a number of scholarly essays in key journals, he is the author of Afterlives at the Plantation, Plotting Agrarian Futures in the Global Black South, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2025. In this conversation, we discuss the place of the rural Black South in Black studies, the expansiveness of thinking and theorizing Black life, and how a Black studies approach to archives and evidence broadens our notion of who does and what is intellectual work. Good afternoon, Jarvis. How are you today?
Hi, John. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. It's closed out today just before we met, before we got online, my last class of the first week of school. So, and a whole host of meetings improvised to just beleaguer me as much as possible. But so I'm doing well because that's behind me. And I'm really happy that we have this time to chat, and the weather has turned in the DMV. It's like upper 70s, just beautiful. So very much fall semester vibes here, and hopefully the same there in North Carolina.
Yeah, we've had beautiful weather here.
That stuff matters when school starts. I do not like showing up to class sweaty. Let me just put it lightly.
Absolutely.
But I'm really happy we have time. You know, I was saying before we started recording, I read your book over the last month, which is just a fantastic book. There'll be a link to it. I'm sure you'll be talking about it in our conversation. I'll have a link to it in the bio that comes along with it. I hope people pick it up. It's a really fantastic book. I think really thoughtful and rich. And as I said, really well written. I actually enjoyed reading the writing. I do not always say that. Just want to put that out there in public. And I learned as we were talking, this is your beginning of your year as associate professor. So welcome to that side of the academic line and all of that. So long way of saying welcome to the podcast. Really happy you made the time, and I look forward to this.
Thank you so much, John. I'm really excited to be here. A big fan of the podcast, and thank you so much for your kind words about the book. I appreciate you taking time to read it. I know it's a bit of it's a hefty book. So
it is.
Yeah. I'm really grateful that it made your summer reading list. I don't take that for granted.
It did. I picked up the package out front of my house, and I was like, did they send me 2 copies? No, dude wrote a long book, but it doesn't read like a long book. So
Thank you.
That's no easy piece to do that. So
Thank you.
We'll have a chance to talk about your research and how you think about Black studies and the connection between those. But I really wanted to start off, as we always do, with a more personal question and just ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And also, for me, always a question, what sustains you and keeps you committed to this kind of work?
Yeah, those are great questions. What drew me to this work was an abiding interest in diaspora. I think even as a child, I was intrigued by the experiences of Black people in other parts of the world. My older sister, she's 7 years older. When she went to college, she had friends from other parts of the world. She went to a historically Black college. And so I met one of her friends who was from either the Bahamas or from the Virgin Islands. And I just remember being enamored and wanted to learn so much about her experience and how it compared to my experience as someone who grew up in Mississippi in the Deep South. And so then as an undergraduate student at Tougaloo College, a historically Black college in Jackson, Mississippi, I was introduced to African writers such as Chinua Achebe and Bessie Head. And I was fascinated again by the similarities between sort of their depictions of how colonialism impacted the African psyche and the Black experience in the United States, especially in the Jim Crow South or in the U.S. South, and my experience as a child who'd grown up in the aftermath, right, of segregation and Jim Crow. And so, Black history and culture were essentially non-existent in my grade school curriculum. So by the time I reached college, I think I was really hungry for it. And so at the behest of my undergraduate mentor, Candace Love Jackson, I applied and was accepted to the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program where I studied the connections between the Harlem Renaissance and the Negritude movement. And so a funny story about that, I learned that my advisor, my Mellon advisor, Dr. Barbara Deese, may she rest in peace, she had written her dissertation on negritude. So I approached Drs. Deese and Dr. Jackson about teaching a course on negritude, as well as other courses that I thought would prepare me and my colleagues for graduate study. And so to their credit, they taught at least 2 of those proposed courses. And so
Amazing.
that course, introduced me to the experiences of Black people in the Caribbean and so forth and so on. And so I continued that research when I entered graduate school at Columbia. When I got there, I was introduced to sound studies. It was all the rage at the time. And so I wrote my MA thesis on depictions of blues women and the importance of Black women's vocality in African American literature. And so I thought I would write a dissertation on sound and literature. But then I took a course with Farrah Griffin. It was called The Black South. And it was about hemispheric ties between the U.S. South and the Caribbean and Latin America. And it completely transformed the trajectory of my work forever. And so I'm indebted to that course. I was introduced to the work of Zora Neale Hurston, which I can say more about now or at another time. But Hurston's her ethnographies, Mules and Men and Tell My Horse, reading those 2 texts together really changed how I understood the South and understood my relationship to home. And that particular course and those particular texts took me on this journey toward trying to understand the Black South and its relationship to a broader global South.
First of all, I love it when names of mentors and teachers and classes pop up in these narratives. It's so important to get these words and names out there. And this I mean, it's stating the obvious, but the idea that Black history and cultural production would be absent of a Mississippi school curriculum is just some kind of meta commentary. It's like the breadbasket of culture, American culture.
Right. That's right. That's right.
But and it's amazing how those that's not amazing, but that's exactly what the power of education is, right? To not only do a corrective, but do this absolute inversion. So
that's right.
I love that. Sound studies, you can always come back to as well.
That's right. That's right. Well, I realized that in terms of sound studies, that it was a really important methodology, right? For me. So it's absolutely a part of my thinking. And I still teach a course on music and African American literature. And there may be a sound studies book in me after all, or it's certainly been a part of my writing, both in the book and in articles. But I realized that for this first project, there was an abiding interest in thinking about diaspora with the U.S. South in mind.
Yeah. No, this is really important work. It's super interesting, and negritude showing up at the heart of that is. We could talk a lot about that because I'm interested in these resonances and non-resonances of negritude in the U.S. context. But not to turn it into that kind of podcast. But let me ask you about Black studies. How it functions in your imagination. Like, what's the sort of portrait of Black studies for you? And I always want to ask this in the context of its origins, which was, late 1960s and early 1970s, when there was a twin demand, right? The demand of that there be a place on college campuses for the study of Black life, and that the disciplines that failed this, Black studies was going to be that place where Black history, culture, sociology, music, and so forth. That this is the place where it could be studied, right? Mm-hmm. And so that intellectual project of Black studies really comes from that demand, right? To there be a place on a campus and in a classroom for the articulation of the Black intellectual tradition, but that came alongside and had its other side of the demand, which was the collapse in the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, collapse of so many of those easy distinctions between study and activism, between the classroom and community, between engaging with the intellectual tradition and prescriptive political claims on the world. And I think that the field of Black studies really has that tension in it still today. And tensions are tensions. Sometimes they're productive, sometimes they're contradictions. But between the political demand for a certain kind of politics of Black liberation, a prescriptive model, and the descriptive model, which is the demand that Black studies attend to the nuances and complexity of the U.S. and beyond Black intellectual tradition. So that's all a way of staging this question for you. What is, in that context, is the portrait of Black studies that you work with?
Yeah. I really appreciate you laying out the tension in the field, or those tensions that I believe existed at the emergence of the field and that continue, and perhaps maybe a perennial tension in the field. In my work, I'm often thinking about the relationship between and wrestling with the relationship between Black studies and the lived experiences of Black people. Right? Where do they overlap? Where do they diverge? And where are they in tension with each other? Ultimately, I think that the problem of anti-Blackness is so pervasive that I think we need all of it, right? We need
Mhm.
our activist foot soldiers, right? And we need our knowledge producers, our theorists and our practitioners, our artists and our scholars, right? And in many cases, right, the separation between these categories is a falsity anyway. And I think that's one of the things that I love about Black studies is that it gives me a space to um, uh, bring all of these different hats together. And I think in my work, I attempt to do that as well, particularly through a kind of sort of multimodal approach, right? That puts the literary alongside the sonic, alongside the visual, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that I try to produce work that acknowledges and celebrates the beauty, the dignity, the intellectual sophistication and complexity of Black people and culture, from intellectuals to the laypersons. And I think as a scholar who's trained in literature, my work skews toward the tradition of writers and artists.
Mm.
But I've come from a tradition, like I said, it- the when I was growing up, I didn't have Black history in my curriculum, so I learned about Black history and culture through the Black church and through Black civic organizations, right? And
Mm,
so I
mhm.
think my relationship to Black studies is one in which I learned about those things outside of a traditional sort of classroom setting, outside of a traditional um, schoolhouse, and so I think that has always been my desire as a scholar, is to figure out ways to translate that work. I don't know that that's everyone's calling, right? To translate the ideas that we grapple with in the university to a broader public. But that is what drew me to Black studies. It's what
Hmm.
grounds me, and it's one of the things that I, to be quite transparent here, that I'm wrestling with, right? Now that I'm on the other side of tenure, now that my book is out in the world, was trying to write the book in a way that it was accessible to and of interest to scholars and scholarly debates, but also that it was legible to people outside of the university as well, who might have an interest in what I'm writing about, right? So I'm always wrestling with that tension, but I think it's worth wrestling with, and I'll say lastly, one of the places that was so important for my intellectual formation as a Black studies scholar was the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, where I did my graduate work. We call it IRAS, and it was my intellectual home, and it was also my sort of social and communal and familial home, as
Mhm.
well. My PhD is in English and comparative literature, but IRAS is where I spent so much time. And what I loved about IRAS is that you had some of the leading scholars, in the field, who were on faculty there, or who were coming through that space. But there was always an effort to ensure that that door was open to people in the community, in the Harlem community, in the broader New York area, right? And so I saw that demonstrated, and it didn't always work well. Sometimes we spoke over each other's heads, or sometimes our priorities and our commitments were different, right? But I really appreciated the effort, right? The kind of grappling and wrestling, right? To ensure that that the scholarship was being translated and hope, in some ways into some type of political action, or that sometimes, or that the political questions, right, could deepen, right, the activist questions could deepen the scholarship, right, as well.
Yeah.
So I like that kind of messiness, right? 'Cause I think there's something really productive in bringing those two sides together.
And I love the you use the word a few times, wrestling, and
Mhm.
I really like that. I appreciate that way of configuring it, because wrestling is productive, because it's like, I don't know, it's a contest between opponents that are matched well enough to each has its strength and its right to be there. And I think there's so much in, I think especially when the stakes are as high as they are in Black studies, where it is like talking about Black life and justice in history, the stakes are so high that the desire to be on the other side of wrestling, when somebody has emerged victorious, and so we know sort of where we stand or how to stand, is I think that compulsion is really strong. And I really appreciate you giving some like witness there to the significance of trying and coming up short, but also understanding maybe that's just some differences, or maybe that's where we have to think a little bit differently and challenge each other in new ways. And that sense of being of wrestling and being in that messy space as productive, rather than a sort of side of shame or frustration, or even, because these debates can get very intense, it can be a question of who's real and who's not, as a Black studies scholar. And I really like that characterization. It's also I have to say, it was very weird to give that juxtaposition of the idea of political struggle and study as a tension, given what you said about Black history in Mississippi, right? Was not a part of my curriculum. It's like, well, maybe the study is pretty damn political. And just in 2025, it's kind of hard to say that books aren't, pretty visceral political struggle into themselves.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. You've hit the nail right on the head, right?
I think about that a lot. Ashley and I formulated these questions in, early 2024. And then in 2025, we're like, that's an interesting juxtaposition to even propose under this fascist regime.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Absolutely. We're in just doing the work of Black studies, just incorporating Black history into a curriculum, or Black culture in a curriculum, is in and of itself political, in this particular moment. Yeah.
I had a student ask me, actually, on the first day, I had ask me anything, 15 minutes to wrap up. And they always ask the same questions, but it was an unexpected question. It said, the current government thinks you, as a professor, especially a professor in Africana studies, like, you're an enemy of the state. What do you think? And I was like, I think if I'm the enemy of the state, you need better enemies, right? But also, what does that say about you, that the mere teaching of Du Bois makes you an enemy? So, but here we are.
Who also was regarded as an enemy of the state, right?
Exactly.
So in some ways, we are it's the changing same, or we are in a kind of Du Boisian tradition. So that's not a bad thing either.
I know he got skewered by a lot of reviewers, but when Coates said that anti-Black racism was metaphysical, the structure of reality, I'm like, maybe we revisit that one. Oh shit.
Right. That's right.
Well, let me ask about your research and thinking about the field of Black studies. We talked, you talked a little bit about sort of the ideas that led up to your book, and everybody needs to pick it up and read it, and the aims you had with your book. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you think of your work as a scholar in relation to the field of Black studies? You work from, cultural history, transnational sensibilities, literary study, um, and I'm interested how you think this collage of interests or interpretive frames and sensibilities, how you think it makes your research fit in the history of Black studies, but
Mm.
also what boundaries do you see it pushing? What horizons do you see it opening up for the field?
Oh, that's a really, really great question. I think my work builds on so many of the contributions of the field. And I'm indebted to those architects of the field who uh, challenged, right, the privileged position of written forms of literature and encouraged us to listen, right, to Black music and stories and sermons and other vernacular cultural modalities. I'm indebted to those folks who push us to think beyond the U.S. nation state, beyond Black American identity and culture, to consider the histories and the experiences and the worldviews of other Black folk across the world, and to those who've challenged us to interrogate the unique positionalities of gender and sexually marginalized peoples or poor people, et cetera. Right. So all of those strategies, all of those methodologies, all of those contributions are in my toolkit. And I think that, my approach is I'm trying to build on what they've given me through nuance, right? I'm trying to
Mm,
nuance it via geography and ecology, right? So my work has been invested in pulling the field southward, right? It's rooted in the U.S. South, but deeply connected, right, to thinking with and through what I call the global Black South, right? The ways that the U.S. South is tied to the Caribbean and Latin America, specifically, but also to the broader Black world, the broader Black global South. So my goal has been to destigmatize this region, especially the Black South in the U.S., by helping the field view it as a site of cultural and intellectual sophistication and political possibility. Right.
mm,
Um, it invites a reconsideration of a space that, in my view, Black studies, at least of the recent past, has left behind. Right?
mhm.
When we talk about Black modernity, it's always urban and northern, right? It's not southern or rural, and even that deserves more complexity, right? Because, right, obviously there's an urban South that we don't really talk about either, maybe outside of Atlanta. So my work marks a kind of geographic and ecological intervention that challenges the field to reconsider the South, both the U.S. and the global, in all of its complexity. And it also takes up agriculture and farming and rurality and countryness, we might say, in light of Beyonce's Cowboy Carter, right? And that argues for their complexity and sophistication as well. What does it mean to think about Black farmers as intellectuals of the land, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, my work it's so interesting that I didn't see myself. This is not the project that I set out to write. It's
Mm,
not the work that I set out to pursue, but
okay.
but there's a way in which, as I delved into the archive, that I noticed contradictions. I noticed that the way that we talked about uh, the U.S. South, Black Southerners, Black folks from the Caribbean as well, the broader global South, that it didn't square with um, my lived experience, right, as well, and that it lacked a lot of the nuance and dynamism and sophistication. And so my work has really been about trying to restore that, and inviting us to situate ourselves differently geographically. I never understood myself or viewed myself as someone who's going to write about agriculture. But once I understood the complexity of and the uh, intellectual labor that it requires, right, to engage in certain in farming, and that was happening at a place like Tuskegee, which is the so central to my book, George Washington Carver's um, sustainable agricultural work there. Once I began to understand what it was that Carver was doing, I said, "Wait, whoa, this is modern, right?" Um,
Mm.
this is what it means. And we can't divorce it from the modern simply because it is situated in the South because of the racial violence of that space, in part because the modernity is a violent project in and of itself. We can't divorce it from the modern simply because it's not urban, right? We can't divorce it from the modern simply because it's not northern, right? And so once I began to unravel, right, grapple, unravel, right, is another really important word for me. A kind of disruption, and I think Black Studies gives us the tools to do that, to think about things um, uh, from the outside, to question them, right? And that's one of the gifts of Black Studies. It's given me the language of decolonizing, of deconstructing, right, of disrupting. So it encouraged me to disrupt how I had been taught, either directly or indirectly, to think about the South, to think about agriculture, and to allow myself to arrive at a new answer.
Thank you for that. It was really thoughtful and super interesting. I always like, to tag, when possible, intro podcast. Valerie Grimm's podcast with my colleague Ashley is fantastic, talking about the special kind of challenges, but mostly in terms of like the world of scholarship of writing rural Southern history.
Yeah.
And I found I wasn't the host, so I was a listener, editor person for that one, and I was just totally enthralled by just the kind of stuff you're talking about. It's like what does it mean to sort of try to make claims about a region or a place or a sensibility, that a geography and geology that no one has understood as part of, the modern part of a proper kind of historiography, these kinds of things. So thank you for that. And, when you said that about, farmers as intellectuals of the land, or land intellectuals, I forget the exact phrase, but, that struck me when you said that is one of the most important aspirations of the field of Black Studies. It's expanding what we mean by an intellectual, right? To understand intellectual work, to not just come from the essayist. I mean, that's the easiest, to go pull a Du Bois book down and you can write multiple books out of his book. But what does it also mean to think about the session player as an intellectual, and thinking of sound studies, or the farmer as an intellectual, and, what kind of critical work is being done there. So all that's to say, like I heard so many of the important, I think, foundational sensibilities of the field of Black Studies, and that which the actual institution and scholarship of Black Studies, I think, still struggles to practice because it requires us to think and write so differently.
That's right. That's right.
And sort of thinking then about, writing and how you put together a research project, I wanted to ask, ask you to talk a little bit about this. You said, you had done your graduate work in some ways in the Black Studies Institute at Columbia, although your PhD was technically in English Comp Lit, and now you teach in the Department of English. And so you have an interesting relationship in terms of your education to disciplines. Certainly you're in an English department, that's a disciplinary department. Although I always say, because I'm 49%, they love percentages at University of Maryland, 49% in English. English departments are increasingly not really disciplinary. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But comparative literature, I think especially, is kind of anarchic that way. So that's just a way of saying, your position now as a professor, and therefore your host place as an intellectual, but also your graduate training, have this interesting straddle between disciplinary and non-disciplinary sensibilities. And I'm interested to hear you talk about how that relationship to both disciplines and non-disciplines has shaped how you conceive a research project, but also if you want to talk about how you conceive a classroom.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question, John. Yeah, I think I'll answer by way of an anecdote, or at least begin by way of an anecdote. When I was in graduate school, Farah Jasmine Griffin was my dissertation chair, and I was working on my proposal, and I submitted an early draft of my dissertation proposal, and I'm sitting across the desk from her, and she looks up. She's read the proposal and getting ready to talk about it. And she looks up from her desk and she says, "You know you're in an English department, don't you?" She said, "I I earned
Nice.
my degree in American Studies." And so I got a big chuckle out of it, but also that meant I had to go back to the drawing board and think about how I was going to pursue the questions that I was asking, from that disciplinary place, and I think I didn't really have an understanding of that yet, um, uh, because of that kind of disciplinary professionalization or those disciplinary boundaries, because I was trained by people who had earned their degrees and were at the forefront of the fields of American studies, African American studies, and who were very interdisciplinary and multimodal in their own work. Right, all of the classes that I was taking, right, were inviting me to think not only about the literary, but the literature, but literature in relation to other modalities or other disciplines. And so I took, several courses in Black Studies, and so that was the model that I knew, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, but I'm grateful for Farah's prodding there. Because it did encourage me to go back to the table and think about, okay, what are the methodologies that I want to deploy or employ in my work? What are the questions that I want to ask, right? What are the texts that I want to work with? And it didn't mean that I could not engage sound studies or visual culture studies or so forth and so on, but it meant that I needed to figure out what were how did those fields sit alongside, how did I put them in conversation productively with literature, right? Um, and so I completely agree with you that English departments are increasingly non-disciplinary, and I think that that's why I've been able to do the kind of work that I do, um, and why my work has been embraced in those kinds of departments. So when I think about a question or a topic that I'm interested in pursuing, my strategy is I naturally think about, well, what have the writers said about it, right? Just
Mm,
that's my intellectual home. I know the tradition, right? Um, and what have the essayists and the novelists and the fiction writers and so forth and so on said it. But then the next question that I ask, what have the musicians said about it, right? Or what have the visual artists said about it, and so forth. And so I'm always thinking in a kind of multimodal way. Um, and I like to think of myself as a Hurstonian. I mentioned earlier in our conversation that when I encountered Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographies in graduate school, it changed the trajectory of my work. And I teach a course currently. I've been teaching it for several years now. A single author course on Zora Neale Hurston that thinks about Hurston as an architect of Black studies, and it's because as I was reading Hurston's work and immersing myself in her archive to write the dissertation, I realized, we often uphold Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk certainly as a father of Black studies, the Souls of Black Folk as a canonical text, and it models Black studies in terms of the various disciplines and sort of methods that Du Bois employs. Right, there's history, there's political economy, there's fiction, etc. But I thought, well, Zora Neale Hurston was doing the same thing, right? And so, what would it mean to put this Black woman, right, at the forefront of a Black studies uh, uh, tradition, and to invite my students to think about Black studies methodology, right, through Hurston's work, right? She is experimenting, and that's one of the terms that anchors both my work, but also anchors my teaching, is this experimentation across so many different modalities, right? She's writing fiction, she's ethnography, sound recording. She's a kind of a amateur documentary filmmaker. She's experimenting with dance, right? As she's trying to document and to preserve Black folk culture, but also to demonstrate its richness, to demonstrate its sophistication, to demonstrate its dynamism, right? And so my approach to both my research and my teaching is Hurstonian in that regard. I'm always thinking about what happens if I put the literary alongside these other modalities. And the last thing I'll say as it relates to that approach transformed my thinking about Tuskegee. Right? When I was reading Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, and thinking about, I thought when I was working on an early draft of the dissertation, that I would, write one chapter that would compare Washington to Garvey and kind of get out of there, keep it moving. I was not interested in a Tuskegee project, certainly not interested in a Washington project for all of the reasons that you can imagine. But as I, again, immersed myself in Tuskegee's archive, I recognized that, wait a minute, Tuskegee is experimenting with visual culture. There's a vast visual culture archive here. There's a vast sonic archive here. The second chapter of my book, engages this. And I thought, Washington is doing the same thing that, say, Du Bois is doing with the Georgia Negro photographs, right? He's doing the same thing that they're doing at Fisk, right, with the Fisk Jubilee Singers and so forth and so on. And so I thought, whoa, there's an entire aesthetic tradition here. What if I re-engage and rethink Tuskegee through its aesthetic production, right? And then, of course, later on, I arrived at the kind of ecological, right, component of Tuskegee as well. But that is what that sort of multimodal interdisciplinary approach has been crucial to my rethinking of that figure, that rethinking of that space, and is a central aspect of both my research and my teaching.
Thank you for that. That was super interesting. I also love that you have when you said I have an anecdote, usually anecdotes sort of indirectly, you were like, no, the anecdote is exactly the question you just asked.
Exactly.
I was like surprised. I was like, oh, okay. So the anecdote is actually totally matchy.
That's right.
In an amazing way. But it's such an important thing to think about, because I think that, it's absolutely the case that the more conscious we are of the terms under and conditions under which we undertake research projects, I think it makes research projects so much better if we understand, I have a question and I figure out what can help answer it. Or, as you said, like, there's this text says this, what were the musicians saying? What were I love these moments of self-thematization. And, we were talking beforehand about second, third books and stuff. That's a level of possession of how you think that, I think makes other books possible.
Mm-hmm.
Took me a while to figure out. I just talk about what other people talked about. I always had delusions that I had some big idea. I was like, no, I'm just more of a reporter. And I think there's dignity in that. Anyway, well, I have two more questions for you. And the first one, the penultimate question here is sort of a big question about the field of Black studies historically in the future, or in the present, really. What do you think, in its 50-something years of history, what do you think Black studies has done well?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
That is a big question, John. Or those are big questions. I think that the field has done a really good job of institutionalizing itself at some of the most important institutions in this country, right? We'll say Black studies in the kind of U.S. context. And I think, for me, it's given us the theoretical and methodological tools to interrogate power, inequality, injustice, and the social and structural hierarchies and inequities that order our modern world, right? Mm-hmm. It taught us how to decolonize, to deconstruct, and to disrupt, right? The 3Ds, I'll say, right? Mm-hmm. And it's elasticized and pushed at the limits of Western epistemic modalities, kind of what you said earlier, or explicitly what you said earlier, right? Really opening up what it means to be an intellectual, right? And where knowledge production takes place and who are the producers of knowledge, right? What are its forms and methods? And, giving us the tools to challenge all forms of oppression, be they racial or gendered, or sexuality, class, ableism, et cetera, right? And so, and I also think that, it's done a phenomenal job of recovering Black people from the margins of history, right?
Mm.
And so I am indebted to Black studies as an intellectual formation for all of those contributions. And, you know, I'm not sure that I can say what it hasn't done so well, but maybe I'll speak to what I think it can do a little bit better, right?
Mhm.
And and I think as it relates to my own work, I think the field could benefit from engaging the South more. Surprise, surprise. I think that the field could be more thoughtful about its regional and geographic and sort of class biases. And within that, its bias against rural or country people, a kind of anti-Southern bias. I feel that firmly. So I'm so excited by, so much work that's coming out or that has been coming out in recent years, both in terms of writers and artists, but also in terms of the kind of intellectual producers in the academy, other scholars who've been writing about the South in more interesting and dynamic ways. Something I like to call a kind of new Southern studies or new Black South studies, I suppose, is what I would call it. And so I'm really grateful for folks who are doing that kind of work. I think that we focus too much on resistance and radicalism to the exclusion of those projects that may be more subtle, but no less invested in advancing and propagating Black life and culture. And that's what I try to
Mm.
draw our attention to, right? And in the book. And I think, we have to remember that radicalism and resistance are contextual and contingent. Right. So it's the when and the where and how of radicalism, right? What was radical in a particular moment, may not be radical today, and vice versa, right? And so I think that we could do better about uh, interrogating the possibilities and the affordances of these sort of past freedom dreams, even when those freedom dreams are not, consistent with or don't reflect our contemporary, politics, I suppose, right? Um, and another area where I would like to see the field do more work is. And again, this is sort of drawing from the book. How can we think about the past, present, and future of historically Black colleges and universities, right, as sites of Black study? That's
Mm.
what
Mhm.
became really apparent to me, both as I was writing the book, both as a graduate, as an alum of an HBCU, but and as someone who placed or for whom an HBCU was at the center of this recent book. I thought, whoa, wait, these folks are engaging in Black study. This is Black study, right? But I don't know that we always connect the field to or think about Black study in those locations, right? So how can we do that better?
I just have to say also, speaking, because I mentioned before, I love intra podcast references, and I forget the order of them, but and so maybe one or two before you or one or two after you. Just did one with Michael Gillespie. And one of the things he said when I asked him about, so how did you get interested in the study of Black life? He was like, I went to Morehouse, and although they didn't have a Black studies program I studied in, it was just like the entire university was Black study.
Right. That's
And
right.
it was just, he gets into it in some detail. So people, listening to this should make sure they listen to Michael's, because I found it totally interesting. And I had that thought. And I'm so glad you articulated it in some actual detail. I was like, we should have like a separate podcast on the theme of HBCUs as sites of Black studies. And
I agree. Absolutely. I think it's so important. And, those are the places where Black folks were studying for the majority of the 20th century before they were admitted to predominantly white institutions. And so, we talk a bit about Du Bois's Atlanta University studies, and my work tries to bring to the forefront the Black study that was happening in a place like Tuskegee. But each of these institutions has their own, unique and individual history, right? And so, what happens if we drill down into what was happening in each of those spaces, right? And recapture the work that they were doing, and not only the work that's happening or that has happened or that continues to happen in Black Studies departments departments at more elite universities.
So yeah, there's so much there in the question of the South too. I loved you putting it that way. I've thought a lot about writing, maybe essays or maybe a short book, but just thinking about some figures that I work on and their sort of relationship to the South. And they're figures like, Du Bois. Du Bois when he talks about being in Atlanta, he's clearly a foreigner. Right.
Yes.
Baldwin, I think, too, when he talks about Atlanta, and it's interesting that both of those are Atlanta. I think about that. Like, what does it mean? It's Atlanta. It's not Jackson. It's not Baton Rouge. It's not Memphis. But
New Orleans.
All these like really rich questions. New Orleans, yeah. And so yeah, I love that question. And when I ask that sort of what is Black Studies not done so well, people usually do exactly what you did with it, which is say like these are actual really rich areas for research, and they have not been there. And it is always interesting for me. I won't go into it, but I'm starting this book project on soul music and deconstruction, and I want to talk about Malaco and high records. And when I talk to people about it, they're like, "Well, what about Stax?" But also like, "What about Motown?" It's like really just sort of moving as much out of the South, because high records is a totally Southern sound compared to Stax, which is not a critique, it's just a different sound. Malaco, Denise LaSalle, Johnny Taylor, that's a whole different.
I love that you know Malaco records. I grew up listening.
I got a hug from Denise LaSalle.
Oh, man.
It was shall we say, a little inappropriate on her side.
Okay.
It's just if you know Denise LaSalle's music, you'd be surprised if it was a sanitary hug.
That's right.
Anyway, so in some ways you may have already answered this, but I'll ask this final question.
Sure.
Thinking about the future of Black Studies, or thinking in the context of Black Studies in this moment, what is the question you would want us to be asking? What is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
I think I'd like us to ask ourselves, where do our biases lie as a field? All right. To stay connected to that, right? Where might our grand narratives need more nuance and reconsideration? All right. What theories, histories, and analyses have we taken for granted? What people or cultural forms and knowledges have been overlooked, right? Perhaps this is unsurprising for someone who's asking us to think about and with and through the South, right? To wrestle with the complexity of that region. But I think that that's an approach that could actually be useful across the field, not only in relation to the South, right? How are we going to ensure our longevity at a moment when the commitments made in the aftermath of 2020 are being repealed and rolled back at lightning speed, along with the commitments that were made prior, right, to that 2020 moment, right? We're under attack. So what's our strategy when our universities are abandoning us, right? To come back to the question of HBCUs, right? What is our commitment to HBCUs? Some of the first sites of Black study, right? Many of which are in an extra precarious position, especially under this current administration. To come back to something I was sharing earlier, when I was growing up, the church and other civic organizations provided a kind of para-curriculum, right, on Black history that was crucial because my grade school didn't teach Black history, as I've shared. So, I'm wondering, and I understand that, the Black church is not necessarily the center of Black life anymore, but what are the other institutions and tools that either already exist or that we can create to sustain the work of Black study beyond the university, right? How do we make our work legible and accessible to audiences outside of the academy, right? So, can we pursue a kind of freedom school ethic, right? Especially at a moment when DEI is on the chopping block and the White House is calling for the whitewashing of American history at the Smithsonian institutions and so forth and so on. I'm not naive about this. I do understand the difficulty of this, given that this kind of work is not tenurable work, right? Most often. right, the academic industrial complex makes this public facing work and the kind of work of translating our work for for broader audiences impossible in some instances, right, without the backing of tenure. So I'm not naive, but I do think that it's a problem that we need to address, and perhaps it's our tenured folk or the folks who are in more secure positions, right, who can take on the brunt of that kind of work. So yeah, a kind of freedom school ethos or freedom school strategy for ensuring that we get the idea. We're doing such incredible work, right? And these ideas, we have to continue to get them to the broader public. It doesn't mean that we haven't been doing it, but we have to remain committed to that kind of strategic political work.
It's an amazing place to wrap up, because that really hits at the conscience of Black studies, and raises this question of a time of immense political crisis. Who are our allies, and who do we want as our allies? Not just who is, but who do we want as our allies? And this raises that question in important ways that connect to its origins, right? Liberation struggle, community, and so forth. So thank you so much for this, Jarvis. I was really looking forward to it. I thought it was going to be really interesting, and it's like so many of these has really exceeded my even my best hopes. So this has been fascinating. You've laid out so many questions and sets of sort of moral and political challenges to us. Everyone listening, I mean, everyone's going to take a lot to think about from this. And I really appreciate your time, and your thoughtfulness is just really a gift to the podcast series. So thank you for that.
Thank you, John, for the opportunity. I've had a wonderful time. Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.